Hey, everybody. Thanks for kicking off your weekend with us. DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. My name is Brandon Adams. Kind of fun this morning driving in. A little bit of a snow flurry out there. So y'all stay safe and I guess stay bundled up. And I appreciate you spending some time with us. More aftermath from National Signing Day on today's program. It'll include Jeff Sintel in just a few minutes. There is at least a slim chance we may also have a special guest call into today's show. If that happens, you'll know it when it does. And if it doesn't, well, my apologies for even getting your hopes up, but there is at least some chance we may do something a little out of the norm on the program here today. I'll keep you updated on that. I want to begin today with something I kind of briefly touched on yesterday, that connection that exists between recruiting success and national champions, and why Georgia fans really ought to be celebrating what happened on Wednesday, even though there is still a little bit of impatience out there about when that next big domino is going to fall on the field with that big-time success. We'll start with that. A little more from Kirby on the Todd Monk and Jamie Newman stuff. First chance we had a chance to hear from Smart on that was this past weekend, and a really fun Nick Saban rant at the end of the show, which I think you will laugh at. And I think buried underneath the surface of all that is maybe a little sign that the pressure of trying to keep up with the Joneses in college football, maybe getting to old Saban a little bit. We'll do that as we go through the show. It's DawgNation Daily. It's the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Kroger, fresh for everyone.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
We've got a very fun show planned for you. We appreciate you being here. Before we're done today, you got to hear this thing from Nick Saban on National Signing Day. Now, it's being kind of spun as, well, Saban gives it to a reporter. There's obviously nothing that the average college football fan loves more than a coach like Saban laying into some young reporter, and maybe an example of that. But I think from a Georgia fan's perspective, and really even from, fan bases beyond just UGA, there's another thing to kind of read into this on Nick Saban. We'll do that here coming up in just a couple of minutes. It is Jeff Sintel on today's show. A lot of recruiting talk with him. There is at least a small chance we may have another guest on today's program. Typically, when we take the airwaves, we, for the most part, know exactly what's going to happen. There's at least some chance today that we may call a bit of an audible over the course of the show. But let me begin with this, though. I think there's a conversation that UGA fans have with themselves that is very different than maybe some people think that it is. Because, listen, I kind of like having some fun with people on Twitter from time to time. I sort of, poke at some of the other SEC rivals, the Georgia Bulldogs. And so because of that, I get a lot of responses back. And like the one thing that I always see people kind of hitting me with on Twitter, and I think it's all fair game. I think the little spats back and forth between fans is what makes the SEC fun. But one of the things I hear a lot is, it's been 8 gazillion days since Georgia's won a national championship, however long it's been, 40 years and, kind of all that kind of stuff. There's all that kind of stuff that just sort of opposing fans like to throw at Georgia fans about how long it's been since UGA has won a national championship. Now, quick aside here. I do think it's kind of funny that some of the programs that like to do this, if you start really doing the math, it's getting longer and longer since they last won a national championship. They may have vivid memories of that, but the average recruit doesn't really anymore. So I think it's kind of funny, glass house situation here of some of the programs that mock Georgia for having won a national championship a long time ago themselves are also starting to see a lot of distance between the current day and their most recent national championship. But nonetheless, that's just a quick aside. This is the thing that UGA fans just get beaten over the head with, close but no cigar, finishing second, whatever else. And I think there are a lot of non-Georgia fans who think that UGA fans treat a National Signing Day success, being number one in recruiting, as the exact same thing, just as important as winning on the field. But the truth is the Georgia fans I talk to don't necessarily feel that way. Sometimes they don't necessarily see the connection between the recruiting success and the on-field success because they feel like they've enjoyed a lot of recruiting success in recent years, and yet they're still waiting for that on-field success. So Georgia fans, when it comes to this kind of stuff, are really impatient. And some of the people, not necessarily people who interact with our show, either reaching out to me on Twitter at DawgNation Daily or commenting in our comment sections on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, or even interacting in the forum at forum.dawgnation.com. They're not the ones who you necessarily see this impatience from, but when I kind of just sort of bump into people on the streets or whatever else, when I just talk Georgia football in person, face to face, it is one of those things you do hear a little bit about of, yeah, BA, I like this recruiting success, but when am I going to see some of that on-field success? When is this going to lead to a national championship? I'm getting impatient. I've been waiting a long time, and obviously you know Georgia fans like that. It may very well be that you are a Georgia fan like that. And so with that in mind, when Kirby Smart spoke to reporters on Wednesday, he was asked, how much do you view the fact that you were number one in recruiting again as something that is connected, that could potentially lead to a national championship? What is the connection between recruiting and on-field success, and are they greatly linked in your mind? Now, this clip is a little longer from Kirby Smart. Also, the microphone situation for Kirby was a little weird on Wednesday, but nonetheless, a little longer version of Smart. I do want you to hear everything he says about this because I think it's very, very interesting. Here is Kirby on the topic of on-field success being connected to recruiting. Take a listen.
Do I think this has something to do with it? Absolutely, it has something to do with it. But what that ranking is, or when that happens, or how it plays about, I don't think that necessarily correlates. I think that you having a complete staff, keeping your staff in contact and in keeping them together, and also being able to do it year after year, is a level of consistency and a level of support that you're getting internally to make sure that we can do the things we can do. It's hard to go out and recruit at a high level year in and year out because so many people recruit against you based on who you signed. You better have a good product to sell, which academically we do. I really, there's not going to be a separation between 1 through 10 in these recruiting rankings that really matters. What matters is when they leave. Number one, how many of them are present? How many of them graduated? How many of them lives did you change? And they're not going to be judged just on wins and losses. They're going to be judged on what kind of people are they when they leave your program, because that's going to allow you to recruit the next kid. You know, when Nick Chubb and Sonny Michel leave your program and do great things, that's what's going to sell to the next kid that wants an opportunity to come in and do those same things.
So Kirby kind of goes on a little bit of a different topic there towards the end of that clip, but I think it's all really interesting. And for the most part, Kirby kind of hits on 3 ideas there. That it's not one recruiting class that matters. It's a series of elite recruiting classes stacked year after year after year that really matter. And yes, that recruiting success is connected to a national championship. But he says, but within that sort of top 10 of the recruiting, there may not be a great deal of separation. In other words, being number one, in Kirby's mind anyway, is not necessarily that much better than being number 6 or number 5 or number whatever. And I think that's all really interesting, and I guess to various degrees, it is also true. Let me kind of lay this out. That when Kirby says, yes, recruiting is connected to winning a national championship, I absolutely believe he's 100% right about that. In fact, I would even go a step further to say this. It is really the only thing that all national champions are going to have in common. You're going to have some teams that sort of lean a little bit more on offense, some teams that lean a little bit more on defense. The relative profile of national champions may be slightly different in various degrees, but the one thing every national champion has in common, they are all going to be elite recruiters. And really, the average Georgia fan, the average SEC fan, I don't think he or she necessarily understands just how different his or her favorite team is compared to the rest of college football. There are 130 teams in big-time FBS Division I football, fewer than that in Power 5, but for the most part, there are 130 programs trying to play the same brand of the sport, and really only a tiny fragment of them have any chance whatsoever to win a national championship. Let me give you some numbers to back this up. And by the way, the good news is that Georgia's one of those. Do you remember the other day we had on Bud Elliott from SB Nation? Bud follows Florida State, so he's talking to us about Trey McKitty, and he was giving some other thoughts about other things. Well, Bud is also famous for a theory in college football known as the blue chip ratio, and he writes this every single year. Let me just read you a couple sentences from Bud Elliott from SB Nation that I think kind of puts a numeric idea behind the notion that recruiting success is really the first pillar towards building yourself towards a national championship program. Here's what Bud Elliott says. He says, put simply, and I'll put a link to this when we post the show, teams who win the title have signed more 4- and 5-star recruits than 2- and 3-star recruits over their previous 4 signing classes. Here's more from Bud Elliott. This is where it gets really interesting. This has been 100% true for essentially as far back as modern recruiting rankings have existed. He says, depending on how you define the term modern, or roughly back to the classes that led to super talented USC and Texas national champions there of the mid-2000s. So we're talking about way more than a decade here, going back to kind of like that classic Vince Young versus Reggie Bush, Matt Leinart game. Ever since then, it's the elite recruiting teams as the only ones who win national championships. To sum it up, one more sentence from Bud Elliott from SB Nation. Generally, teams whose signees have been fewer than 50% blue chips, that means more 2- and 3-star players than 4- and 5-star players, over the course of the last 4 years cannot be considered national championship contenders. So from that standpoint, what Kirby Smart says about how, yes, these two ideas are greatly connected, winning a national championship and having great recruiting success, the numbers absolutely back that up. The only teams that can do that, this past year, there were 16 teams who kind of reached Bud Elliott's blue chip threshold, more 4- and 5-star players over the last 4 years than not. Only 16 teams in college football even began the year with a chance at winning a national championship, and Georgia was one of those. Now, when Kirby says there's not a great deal of difference between the top 10, I think numerically, statistically speaking, he's probably wrong about that. Matt Hinton's a guy who's done some research on this. When two teams play, the team that has recruited better, typically speaking, if you didn't know anything else, research has told us that the team with better recruits has about a 2-to-1 shot of winning that game. They'll win 2 out of every 3 times, in other words. So there's kind of that to go along with. So there is, even within the top 10, a little bit of a difference between who's collected the most talent. So, from that standpoint, UGA fans ought to be celebrating what happened on Wednesday. But to spend more time addressing the Georgia fan who says, but BA, how much longer am I going to have to wait? When is all this going to kind of fall into place? The honest answer is that none of us know on that, and it's not a 1-to-1 correlation that being number one this year in National Signing Day is going to make Georgia obviously number one on the field here in 2020. That's not exactly the way that it works. And to complicate things even further, while Georgia's recruiting at a level that it's never recruited at before, those elite teams in the country are kind of also, I'm talking about the very best recruiters, are kind of also doing that as well. A lot of those congregated here in the SEC, probably most prominently the team that's been the biggest thorn in Georgia's side the last couple of years, Alabama. Let me give you another number here just for a moment. There's a guy named Bill Connolly who works for ESPN, and he was looking at recruiting success, and over the course of the last few years, Georgia numerically is now the most successful recruiting program in the country. But when you compare Georgia to the teams in its league, it's not even in the top 10 of talent advantages compared to its average opponent. For instance, Clemson's recruiting, even though it's not quite recruited as well as Georgia has, according to Bill Connolly, has a 33.1 percentage point advantage over the ACC average when it comes to talent and recruiting. So Georgia, by recruiting as well as it has, is essentially only recruiting well enough to keep pace and have a slight advantage over a program like Alabama right now. But if you don't hear me say anything else on this, just hear this, that Georgia, by doing what it has done, has put itself in the elite category. That think about it as a velvet rope around a nightclub or something like that. The kind of thing that makes it possible to win a national championship. Georgia has put itself in that room, has put itself in that group. And eventually the patience that Georgia fans have been asked to show over the course of the last few decades, I think eventually that patience is going to be rewarded, and Georgia fans are going to have a chance to celebrate. Now, when's it going to take place? Honestly, we don't know, but sooner rather than later would seem to be the safest bet. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Kroger. We're glad to have you with us no matter how you get to us. Live on video, 10 a.m., Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. We're on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we are available as a podcast wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. And really glad to have you with us today, and really appreciate our friends at Kroger for making it all possible. Now, by the way, speaking of Kroger, as we head towards Valentine's Day, they got a great deal for you. How about some freshly picked ways to make this Valentine's Day special at Kroger, whether it be the Bloomhouse dozen roses for $20, bouquets starting at just $12.99, and rose arrangements starting at just $39.99. It's a perfect time to start thinking about getting ready for the big day. Make that special someone in your life happy. Valentine's Day, February 14th. Get ready for that at Kroger. All right, let's get ready to go around the doghouse here, too, for a couple of minutes before Jeff Sintel joins us. And I want to shift gears as I promised that I would. Wednesday was an interesting day in Athens because it was National Signing Day, but also our first chance to hear from Kirby on the topics of new offensive coordinator Todd Monken, new quarterback Jamie Newman. And, I joked with Mike Griffith about this yesterday. I think I may have said the same thing on the show some other time. I think that Georgia has had a very interesting offseason. I would say that I think that Georgia's had a pretty bold offseason. I think that, pushing James Coley out the door, which to my eyes is what it looks like Georgia has done, given the success that the Dogs have had over the last few years, I think that's a pretty bold move on the part of Smart. Hiring a guy like Monken, so different from what Georgia has previously had, also feels pretty bold too. Bringing in a guy like Jamie Newman is kind of a step in that direction as well of, man, this may be different, this may be fun this upcoming year, can't wait to see it. Sometimes, though, what Kirby Smart does is a lot more interesting than what Kirby Smart says about what he does. I think Wednesday was an example of that. A little bit bland maybe talking about Newman, a little bit bland maybe talking about Monken, but you just sort of take that for what it is with Kirby Smart. He doesn't like revealing too much about his innermost thoughts and this kind of stuff from time to time. But let me start on the subject of Jamie Newman, the grad transfer quarterback, from Kirby's own mouth, how it was that he came to be here, and maybe a little bit about what might make Newman special for UGA. Here is more from Kirby.
Well, we had researched the entire year with the thought that Jake would have the opportunity to come out early. So we had a pool of 30 to 40 guys that we thought would be potential, whether they were transfers, whether they were grad transfers, whatever it may be. We knew we could possibly be in the quarterback market, and that included high school kids. And certainly excited about Carson and what he can do for our team. He came in and got to practice with us for the bowl game for a couple practices as well. But once Jamie went into the portal and we knew he was going to be a graduate transfer, we started communication immediately. And it was a process of finding out if what he wanted aligned with what we wanted, and also waiting to see what Jake was going to do. So I know Jamie has been very mature about the process. He is, these grad transfers, number one, the fact that graduated college and graduated from Wake Forest, these kids understand what they want, and they're very driven in what they want. They're not really into the whole recruiting process. So he handled it that way, and he's very, very professional about it, and we're looking forward to putting him to work and letting him go out and compete this spring.
So the word compete there at the end is obviously a nod towards this being an open competition. But I think what Smart highlights there is kind of interesting in the fact that we've talked about Newman because of his athleticism. He's also got some value to UJ because he can be an early enrollee. But Smart sort of mentions his experience and his age and just his maturity. And I think it's true that if you kind of compare an 18-year-old to a 14-year-old, think about how different those two young men might be. But the same thing is true when you compare an 18-year-old to a 21-year-old. That maturity might really matter. In fact, this past year in college football with Joe Burrow, who himself was a older guy, a guy who'd been around, played some college football, been through the ringer a couple of times. I think in addition to everything else that Burrow brings to the table, the fact that he was a little older, a little more mature for LSU, I think that also had some value as well. Now, I'm not telling you that Jamie Newman's going to have a Joe Burrow-like season at Georgia. I'm not going to put that kind of pressure on him. But I do think that just based on the results of this past season, a little bit of maturity, a little bit of seasoned experience kind of matters in college football, and I think it's interesting to hear Smart highlight that aspect of it. But how about the offense that he'll be a part of, the one led by Todd Monken, the new offensive coordinator? I think that Monken's going to be a very different looking OC for UGA, producing some very different kinds of plays and hopefully far better results, frankly, than Georgia had this past year. But if that is true, we didn't necessarily get a lot of that from Kirby on Wednesday. Here is more of Kirby, this time on Todd Monken.
I don't know the answer to that. I think the roles on our 2020 staff still aren't complete with our extra assistant coach spot open. I think that will develop and play out as we go along. I'm certainly excited. I know that the kids are excited for an opportunity, and we'll have to see where that goes. I can't honestly say that right now. I think everybody wants to hear some grand speech of opening this up and doing that. That's not necessarily what you need. Is to be productive offensively, score points, and do the explosive plays, which we've talked about consistently.
Yeah, I think you see a situation where if you look at 2017, 2018, the Georgia offenses from a statistical standpoint were really among the nation's best when it comes to the word efficiency. They were efficient offenses, and yet sometimes explosiveness kind of left something to be desired. And over the course of the 2019 season, what you see is the lack of threat of explosive plays also eventually impacted the ability of the offense to be efficient. Not as efficient running the ball anymore, certainly not as efficient passing the ball anymore. So the threat of the explosive play really is the pathway you travel to get that efficiency. And I think the hiring of Monken's really interesting. I think Kirby Smart's discussion about it is frankly not all that interesting, but this may be one of those situations where the results will speak for themselves more than anything that Smart is indeed going to say. It is a DawgNation Daily presented today by Kroger. Fun look in a few minutes about a pretty interesting little rant that Nick Saban had on National Signing Day that Georgia fans in particular might really enjoy. We will do that. Before that, though, more on who UGA signed on Wednesday, how they fit into the big picture for the nation's #1 class for 2020, and by the way, what's next for 2021. Let's talk to Jeff Sintel right now.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
All right, we'll get ready to say hello to Jeff Sintel here. A lot happening on Wednesday for Georgia, putting those finishing touches on the class. And Jeff, a lot of these names we've talked about a good bit now, but it's a little different kind of conversation when you're speaking about them as actual UGA signees. Let me talk about the two big offensive linemen first. Cedric Von Granger, Broderick Jones. Getting those letters of intent was certainly an exciting thing for UGA fans. And, I'll remind folks what you said. I believe it was on an edition of Before the Hedges presented by Kroger about a week or so ago about how, even though we have a tendency to sort of, overhype guys at the end of a cycle, when it comes to Van Pran and Jones, not necessarily an exaggeration that you have believed them to be among the top 5 offensive line prospects of the Kirby Smart era. And at least in Jones' case, I think of him as a potential competitor for some early playing time, not just in terms of what happened on Wednesday, but in terms of how this 2020 class comes together. How do SVP and Broderick Jones kind of factor into your overall evaluation of the class?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. I think it's a great Friday for another number 1 rated recruiting class. I just see, let's just extrapolate. Let's start with Broderick Jones. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Number 1, Georgia does not have a luxury of essential tackle prospects in the class. I think Cade Mays, Isaiah Wilson, and Andrew Thomas definitely takes away a lot of the depth there from the room, especially the tackle positions. And especially the left tackle position. Like, if you ask me, I think Broderick Jones comes in with a chance to probably be the most prototypical left tackle in the program. That's not just his ratings. That's not just where he's rated. He's now the highest rated offensive lineman from the tackle position as far as those recruiting rankings goes in the Georgia program. But if you think about this, I just look at it as that iron sharpens iron type thing. Who is the guy that is going to have to go against the Nolan Smiths, the Azeez Ojularis, the big pass rushers in the SEC? Who is the guy that has the athleticism and skills and the feet to do that? And I think that's clearly Broderick Jones. I'll even go a little step further on the limb, and I'll say if Broderick Jones would have been an early enrollee, I would have labeled him as a true contender for playing time early in his freshman season at Georgia, and I still feel that way. But when you add Broderick Jones and Tate Ratledge, Georgia has a little bit more of the pure tackle type. I think Tate is clearly a right tackle. Going to have more of that nasty streak that Cade Mays showed during his time at Georgia. But Cade will have an adaptability if he wants to play faster, perhaps at guard. I think Lindbergh is a guard-tackle hybrid. I think a lot of those guys that Georgia has signed this year has positional versatility. But the only one to me that looks like a true left tackle and a true tackle no matter what, that would be Broderick Jones. And then when you bring in SVPG, along with Broderick Jones, Cedric Von Granger, I think that's a guy that, if someone wants to sit down with me and have a cup of coffee and start debating about, hey, how does Georgia put its best 5 offensive linemen onto the field? Well, I think Cedric Von Granger is going to check every box in terms of a competitor, strength, composure, intelligence, leadership, capacity to put something on his shoulders and let him handle it. I wouldn't be shocked halfway through the season if Georgia doesn't look at its best offensive line and start wondering whether or not Cedric Von Granger can be the center and then Trey Hill could be the guard.
Interesting.
I just think Cedric gives you a lot of positional versatility there as well.
Let me compare Broderick Jones with another player from a different position here for a moment. Last January, I was with you when we caught up with Trayvon Walker there at the Touchdown Club of Atlanta Awards Banquet, and Jones and Walker are a little similar in the standpoint that they're both elite recruits and they both really loved basketball. At the time, Trayvon Walker was kind of, going through his final season of playing basketball as a high school senior. He's probably a little thinner than he would be as a college football player because that's what basketball kind of does to you. And obviously, as someone who wanted Trayvon to be able to contribute as a freshman, I was kind of looking for some clues from him that he might be ready to do that. And that day when we all talked to Walker, you interviewed him and we aired the video, I really walked away from that discussion feeling like Trayvon Walker is absolutely laser focused, zeroed in on the idea of being a freshman contributor at UGA. It was pretty clear he was having contact with the program. They were sending him some, X's and O's type stuff, certainly keeping track with how he was keeping his body in shape, and he knew he was going to be ready to add that strength back again once the basketball season was done. Just from a mental approach, it was obvious that Trayvon Walker was going to be ready for college, even though he wasn't showing up at UGA until the summer. So Trayvon, in a lot of ways, for me, is kind of a blueprint for how you do this. But in terms of Broderick Jones, who also won't be at UGA until the summer, how does he make sure that he's in the best shape? How does he make sure that he's the most ready to go? And I guess you can say this for any of those guys as well, but just because of the elite nature of his skill set, I want to compare him to Trayvon here for a moment. How do you make sure you're ready when you can't be on campus until the summer?
Well, it's kind of simple with the location proximity there. Lithonia, Redan, that Stone Mountain area, which is where Broderick hails from. And it's really easy for him to come up every Saturday or come up weekends and maybe work out with the team, maybe lift with the team, maybe sit in on some meetings, come up with spring practice a lot, get a lot of those mental reps. It's going to be easy for him to do so. I think being in shape won't be a problem for Broderick Jones. I mean, when you watch him, Brandon, when you watch him work at these elite camps, he didn't really have his best technique. He didn't really, fire his hands. He didn't keep his shoulders parallel to the line. And he still was able to beat these guys because of just he had the feet, he had the raw athleticism to shield them and to just mirror their movements and stay in front of them. I think the thing for Broderick is basically strength and getting back to the 305 pounds he was during his senior season of football. I think that's the mix, or that's the stew in order for him to come in and be able to contribute early at Georgia. I still think that tackle deficit's going to have him a great shot at doing what maybe some of the stuff that Andrew Thomas did, especially when you think about Broderick as a right tackle, and then the clear left tackle. Is that a Warren McClendon? Is that a Xavier Truss? Is that maybe thinking about Jamari Sawyer over on that side? I think the differences between Broderick Jones entering Georgia and Andrew Thomas entering Georgia is Georgia has so much more depth in 2020 than it had in 2017. And I think it will be a little bit harder to break through, but I think Broderick Jones is one of those special athletes that can indeed break through.
So when you look at Ladd McConkey, who signed, there is a tendency, because he's a three-star recruit, because he was late to the process for Georgia, there's a tendency to want to assume that he's less athletic than the other guys that Georgia would have recruited. He's certainly smaller, but in terms of an athleticism standpoint, when you start digging a little deeper, it becomes kind of hard to sort of find the number that points to him being less athletic. Shuttle times and 40-yard dashes and things like that. Even the size. Georgia has recruited over the course of the years, some of this predating Kirby Smart, but it has recruited receivers of a similar size to McConkey in the past. For instance, Terry Godwin wasn't that much bigger than Ladd McConkey when he first came into the program. It's one of those deals of we're just sort of conditioned to assume that sort of late entrance to a class must be less athletic, especially when they're a little bit smaller. But when you start looking for some numbers that kind of sort of speak to the athleticism, you're hard-pressed to find an unathletic number for McConkey, aren't you?
Yeah, you're right, because the numbers that go through my mind as you're breaking that point, Brandon, is I think we spoke about this on Hedges. Everybody's quick with the Hunter Renfros and the Wes Welkers and the Julian Edelmans. Quite frankly, I just see these young men as football players, and you want to start looking at what Ladd McConkey can do. I see a mix of three names. I'm going to use Georgia templates to talk to. I see him being a little bit of Isaiah McKenzie, especially in the return game, a little bit of Terry Godwin, especially in terms of his hands, his route running, and then I see a little bit of Mecole Hardman Jr. Now, nobody in the country that came out is as fast as Mecole Hardman Jr. He just has a rare gear and rare speed, and you see that in the NFL. But here's where Ladd's going to have a little bit more on his resume as a true freshman. Number one, he's going to be a receiver, not a corner like Mecole was during his freshman year. Number two is he's going to have a lot more reps at receiver. His entire sophomore and junior seasons, he was basically a receiver in the North Murray offense. This year he had to play quarterback, which is what Mecole Hardman did for the bulk of his time at Elbert County. The other things you see are the speed is there, Brandon. I think Mecole's times in the 100 meters as a senior were around 10.75, 10.8. Well, Ladd McConkey's put together a 10.85 already in the 100 meters. He did that last spring. And then you see McConkey a little bit bigger, an inch and a half taller than Mecole Hardman. And then you see him, the weights are about the same. I just don't know if Georgia has a guy. I think Ladd McConkey feels another specific niche. I don't know if the Georgia coaches will ever say this on the record in a press conference setting, but I don't know if Ladd McConkey is recruited to Old Georgia. When I mean Old Georgia this is a guy I look at and I say, this is clearly a Todd Monken guy, a guy that can make hay and make some plays in that system. And when you look for the ideal slot receiver now in Georgia's offense, I think Dominic Blaylock could be that guy. I think Jermaine Burton, the other talented freshman, can do anything in the wide receiver room that you would ask him to do. And I think Ladd McConkey is another ideal slot receiver. When we speak about positional deficits, think about how Georgia was in the Sugar Bowl when Dominic Blaylock went down. They didn't really have a lot of guys left like that can bring a lot of the things that McConkey can do to the table. And when we're making all these points and parallels and comparisons, I'll bring up this point too, is that Kirby Smart himself even mentioned that to Ladd McConkey on his official visit. He told him that Nico Hardman was roughly about the same weight that he got to Georgia as well. So I think there's something special, and everybody's quick to trot out there, this is the sleeper recruit, or this is the guy to watch for, or this is the underrated guy nobody's talking about. I think Ladd McConkey's name deserves to be on those lists.
Very, very interesting stuff. Jeff, a name that you and I probably haven't talked a ton about was Darren Branch, the Ole Miss flip on National Signing Day. We've come to expect Kirby flipping somebody from some SEC school. This year it was Branch's turn to be that guy from Ole Miss. Kirby obviously on Wednesday talked about the depth that he wants from his defensive backs and the number of guys that Georgia has kind of played there. So from that standpoint, a guy like Branch has additional value to UGA because it just wants to have a lot of guys in the pipeline there at those defensive back positions. But beyond that, what do you think Darren Branch brings to the table for Georgia?
He just kind of fits the cookie-cutter mold there, Brandon, which was size and speed and some good length there. A guy that could be a star in Georgia's offense, a guy that could be the guy that's the 5th DB or the 6th DB when Georgia has to trot out those fronts to deal with SEC opponents. It's very interesting because he's had a career where he's out of Amite, Louisiana. He was a flip from Ole Miss, but that was one that seemed to me like Georgia really had a great shot once he took that official visit. Now, he did take the late official visit to Ole Miss, but this is a recruit that you look at him and he's about 6'2", he's about 180 pounds. You don't know if he's clearly a safety, and you don't know if he's clearly a corner or clearly a nickel. And I think that's what Georgia tries to do with its defensive back signees, is they try to blur the lines. And remember, when we look at who Georgia's added from the defensive back room, in the last 2 years, Brandon, it's only 7 guys. Remember that 2017 class when Georgia signed 7 defensive backs in that class?
Starting to say 7 is like one class worth of Georgia in the early days of Kirby Smart.
Yeah, and you got, let's pick out the names really fast. Tyreek Stevenson has NFL draft potential oozing out of him. That's at cornerback. Then you have Lewis Seen. That's going to be one of your starting safeties most likely. You look at this year's class, Major Burns. Is he a corner? Maybe he is a corner. Maybe he's a safety. You've got Jalen Kimber, Keely Ringo. I think this guy, Darren Branch, is interesting because, he was a guy that didn't sign during the early period. And I'm always going to take a kind of look in my rearview mirror, and I'm going to look at what Eric Reed Jr. does at Auburn, and I'm going to look at what Darren Branch does at Georgia. And I'm going to wonder. I think Georgia's situation and station changed a little bit with what it thought it had in numbers during the early period and what it needed to sign. That's why I think Georgia was not a stronger contender, or maybe didn't sign an Eric Reed Jr. at that time. And then when they find they're going back into the defensive back space a little bit during the traditional signing period, I think Charles Bell, the 6th, came up. He ended up at Marshall. You had another young man, Kari Johnson, who ended up at Arkansas. You have Darren Branch. So Georgia was looking for another defensive back in terms of that best player available. And to me, you just look at the tea leaves there, and that kind of leads me to believe that there could be, likely might be some future attrition at that position.
I want to finish up in a moment with kind of a broad sort of big picture look at what's next for Georgia for the class of 2021, but I do at least want to mention briefly here that that 2021 class is smaller by one name today. Jared Wilson recently decommitting from the program. This is a guy you've spent some time with. What do you think the decommitment here means? And I guess just sort of reset this in terms of him out, but maybe still considering UGA. Georgia obviously looking at a lot of offensive linemen for that class of 2021. Seems like kind of a priority position. So Wilson gone, kind of what all does that mean?
Yeah, so the offensive line matrix is going to get a little simplified for the 2021 class. I mean, if Georgia has its druthers, I think Georgia would love to sit there and go, okay, Terrence Ferguson, Micah Morris, Amarius Smith. But let's let that be the anchor, the 10th pegs of the class. And you look right there, you see Mims and Morris are clear tackles. You see Ferguson as a guy that could play guard or tackle. Georgia having signed 7 offensive linemen in the 2020 class, I don't know if they go that deep in the 2021 class because there are other positions, inside linebacker, outside linebacker, screams to me in my mind that Georgia will have to address in this cycle that they did not in 2020. But I think Jared Wilson's a good piece. I think he's got good feet. I think he's got a great mentality. He's a worker. Pittman was obviously a guy that he was quite comfortable with, and Pittman was going to lock him down. And then when Pittman leaves Georgia, it opens things back up. Florida State, North Carolina. I think Jared Wilson's going to be a very good college starter, maybe 2 or 3 years type starter, especially at a guard position. And I just don't know. I think Georgia and maybe Jared Wilson are kind of maybe on the same page where they don't know where each school is on the board, but they both still have themselves up very, very high. If Georgia still becomes the school for Jared Wilson, I still think the program will check a lot of boxes for him. But the thing I'll close with on this point is that you got to like a young man that says he's committed. He just had a reacquaintance visit to Georgia for Junior Day and loved it. He said it was his best visit ever he had taken to the University of Georgia. But he didn't feel right taking visits, looking around the country, and saying that he was a commitment at the same time. So for him, for this young man, I think it's admirable that his view of commitment did not also include looking at a lot of other schools, trying to figure his decision out.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice thing. Let me kind of finish up with this. Wilson's 2021 class. Jeff, you and me together here right now, you on the phone, me here in the studio. Let's officially come to agreement that the countdown and race towards National Signing Day 2021 has now officially started. We are now heading straight towards what's really going to be kind of a warm weather season. Gets to be kind of a busy time for recruiting. A lot of these relationships kind of forged during that time. We got camp season here kind of coming up. So Jeff, go ahead and kind of lay out sort of an early timeline of now that the 2021 guys get the stage to themselves. How's it about to play out here over the course of the next couple of weeks?
Well, the month of February is a dark time, or maybe a happy time for college football coaches, where they get to remember what their kids look like. There will be no on-campus recruiting. The NCAA has a new lane where the month of February is you can't host prospects on campus and you can't go see them off campus. So the bonds that will be built, the relationships that will be forged, will have to be done via FaceTime or over the phone. That's how that's going to have to happen. I think a big thing to think about for everybody to perk their ears up, and when everybody celebrates Valentine's Day, Brandon Adams style, to the 9, with everything everyone could imagine for that special someone in his life. February the 15th is another big day for the 2021 recruiting class at Georgia. That's when 5-star safety James Williams, who currently I believe has all 100% of the crystal balls pointing to Georgia, that's when he will announce his top 3. And Brandon, I think I know your taste buds on things like this. When you have a recruit that doesn't start out at all with a top list, just goes straight to a top 3, I think that shows that this recruit almost is ready to get to the table and is almost ready to mean business when it comes to their recruiting. James Williams is a 5-star safety. He's a good enough player, Brandon, that when everybody lists him at 6'5", and it sounds like a great talking point, Gal's a 6'5" safety. James Williams is confident enough in his ability to say, I'm actually about 6'3" and about 7'8". I'm really not quite 6'5". Not that it really matters, because James Williams is one of the top 10 players in the country. He continues to come back to Georgia. He was there in Georgia in January for another Junior Day. There's a lot to like, and I think, Brandon, we've kind of been talking about this on the DawgNation forum for a little bit. I see this 2021 recruiting class being a little less complicated than the 2020 class, and we just put up a story on DawgNation earlier this morning about the roller coaster ride that was the 2020 recruiting cycle, and all the names that kind of went into that. Well, I don't know if the 2021 class will be as hairpin turned as the 2020 cycle was, and I think a lot more of the elite prospects in this class will actually come from the state of Georgia.
See, I'm going to have a little bit of different piece of advice for James Williams than you. If Mr. Williams happens to be listening to us right now, what I would tell him is is that if you're almost 6'4", then you're definitely 6'5". This is just the kind of way this kind of stuff works. I mean, as you become an adult, this kind of thing is really, really important. You know, for instance, you know, I'm maybe a touch over 6'2", which means I'll absolutely answer to being 6'4". You know, you just got to make sure that people kind of know that you're kind of working with a little height there. So, plus it's an intimidating factor of the team that you're playing. So, we've never exactly been, you know, keen on accuracy when it comes to heights and weights in these programs or recruiting manuals or anything like that. So if he is you know, even a touch over 6'3", then go ahead and claim 6'5". I got no problem with him doing that.
It's funny, Brendan, how that doesn't work the same way with everyone's waistline, though. You know, you'll goose that height up, but you want to stay that fit and trim, svelte gentleman that we always were in our early 30s.
Yeah, listen.
When it comes to the pounds.
People ask me how much I weigh, like my driver's license, things like that. 225. Now, listen, at various stages of my life, I have been well more than 225 pounds, but 225 just sort of sounds good. 6'5" just sort of sounds good. Now, one of the problems I kind of run into from time to time as someone who's probably exaggerated my height a little bit here and there is when you run into someone who's either been to an NFL combine or one of these like recruiting events where they do get a little bit more serious about that kind of stuff because coaches do care about this kind of thing. When someone says, no, I've been officially measured and this is how tall I am, and you find yourself to be a little shorter than that person, that sometimes can be sort of a jerk back to reality. But listen, if no one's got the measuring tape out, if no one's got the scales out, then just say whatever you want to. It's sort of like age. You know, age is just a number. Height and weight's just a number. I'm 6'4", 215. I'm 29 years old. As far as anybody knows, especially if they're listening to the podcast, they'd never know any different.
Brandon, that's funny. You know, I will say it has happened on the recruiting trail when these young men go visit these schools and they get weighed and they get heights and weights done. And sometimes they'll be asked to take their shoes off. And some really smart kids are stuffing things inside their socks to make them another inch taller or things of that nature because it will look better on the recruiting board for a 6'2" quarterback rather than a 6 foot, almost 6'1" quarterback when everybody starts thinking about these things. And the 2021 class, it's a brewing period, a marination period there for Georgia, the 2021 class. But I'm going to go ahead and give you a preview. If Georgia's not a top 3 class again in 2021, something went wrong in the cycle because that's just the station where Georgia's at right now.
That is certainly great news to hear, and watch this smooth close to kind of bring things to an end here. You don't have to exaggerate your height, Jeff. You stand tall over the rest of the recruiting community. We appreciate you keeping us up to date on all the recruiting info out there over the course of the last few weeks, and we'll look forward to getting a chance to speak to you here on DawgNation Daily again soon as well.
All right, guys, stay safe. There's a legion of snowflakes falling outside our windows right now in Metro Atlanta. So everybody stay safe. Go get your milk. Go get your bread. Go get that done at Kroger, of course.
Good stuff, Jeff. Thanks a lot.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, listen, that's the first thing you learn about growing up. Exaggerate your height, exaggerate your weight. If you speak into the universe enough, it's certainly going to be true. So, yeah, that's my advice to James Williams there on that. SEC Through time. I go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of our friends at Royal Caribbean. And by the way, speaking of Royal Caribbean, one of the cool things about being on board a Royal Caribbean cruise ship is the entertainment, the action, all those various options you have while being on board. I'm talking about Tony Award-winning Broadway musicals. Royal Caribbean Cruises have been awarded for all kinds of entertainment stuff, the ice skating shows, the dive shows, the performance drones. On those Oasis-class ships, you have the Aqua Theater shows there as well. So just an amazing collection of shows. The Aqua Theater shows, especially when you have like the divers, like Olympic-style diving, like hundreds of feet in the air, or at least very tall in the air, with the ship while moving. It's an amazing experience. Also, the bars, the restaurants, the nightclubs, just everything that makes a Royal Caribbean cruise ship a really fun thing to be on. Go ahead and contact your travel advisor to learn out more about this, or reach out to my friends at the Cruise and Vacation Authority. You can call them 800-326-4971. That's 800-326-4971. Let them know that you heard about them here on DawgNation Daily. For those of you that love recruiting drama, I have some sad news for you. The Jordan Burch saga is now over with. Jordan Burch is now officially a member of South Carolina's 2020 class. And as I said before, when the final piece of drama closes out in recruiting, I'm always a little bit sad. I never really thought late in the process that Burch was any kind of factor to come to Georgia. Had he not gone to South Carolina, he was probably going to go to LSU. But that didn't stop me from being entertained by the fact that South Carolina had not yet gotten its letter of intent, almost like a sequel to what happened, back in December when kind of the same thing sort of played out there, at least to our eyes. It kind of seemed that way. But Birch is now official to South Carolina, and you don't have to look very far to kind of see how all of this kind of goes, how all of this plays out. You see a lot of criticism of Birch, kind of in some people's eyes being a prima donna. You see an example of some people even criticizing the parents because obviously you need a parent signature on this letter of intent. I just, for the most part, see this pretty differently. I really do. Now, there is a chance that there's a prima donna thing going on here, and there's a chance that maybe this wasn't the best way to handle all of this. But sometimes things are not necessarily what they appear, especially when you think about Mark D'Antonio leaving Michigan State right before National Signing Day, all the negative recruiting that goes on with all these programs, the Birch family having their heads filled full of stuff about what might or might not be happening in South Carolina and what Will Muschamp's future might be, things like that. The fact that they might want to do a little bit more due diligence, I actually don't criticize them all that much for it. I really don't know the behind-the-scenes story on Jordan Birch. I'm not sure anyone does. But just because, a recruit wants to handle his business a little bit differently does not necessarily mean that something nefarious has to be at play. Florida looks like they're on the verge of making a coaching hire. It is Tim Brewster. Brewster, you'll remember, has been with Jimbo Fisher before as an assistant, most recently with North Carolina. He was head coach at Minnesota, I think. A pretty disastrous run there with the Golden Gophers for Tim Brewster. And here's my prediction. First of all, Brewster does have a reputation as being a pretty good recruiter. So from that standpoint, he's not going to fit in very well at Florida because he'll be the only one on that staff that you can say that about. But beyond that, there will be a chance for some real fireworks with Tim Brewster at Florida, and it'll probably end up making Florida look bad before it's all said and done. Let me give you an example of this. Do you remember a couple of years ago, Brewster working at Texas A&M with Jimbo Fisher tweeted out, DB alert, nothing but real facts, and he showed all the money that the defensive backs made working with Jimbo Fisher, and on that group was Jalen Ramsey. The total was like basically $8 million, 189 NFL starts, and Jalen Ramsey, upon seeing this kind of social media stuff using Ramsey's name to recruit for Texas A&M, said he didn't teach me not one defensive back technique. Hashtag come get some real truth. Hashtag go Knowles. That was Jalen Ramsey at the time, kind of responding to what Tim Brewster was saying, using him to sort of recruit for Texas A&M. So that kind of gives you an idea that with Brewster, you may get some fireworks. So for Georgia fans who love the idea of Georgia and Florida being recruiting rivals and getting a chance to kind of, put Florida in its place, we've seen Tim Brewster put in his place before in the recruiting trail by Jalen Ramsey, and it may not be too much longer before some UGA guys get a chance to do something like that with Tim Brewster there as well. Speaking of being put in their place, weird comment from Philip Fulmer the other day. Now, Tennessee did kind of creep into the top 10 of the 24/7 Sports Composite Team ranking at the very end there, which was actually a pretty nice showing, and frankly kind of a bad look for Florida because they took a recruit from Florida to kind of get there. But athletic director Philip Fulmer feeling very good about himself right now. He was quoted by Marshall Hughes, a TV reporter in Knoxville, as saying, and this is at some function, that the Vols are back, Fulmer said. Before long, we're going to be taking a bite out of everybody we plays. He uses an expletive for derriere. First of all, I would say to Fulmer, I'm not quite sure that phrase means what you think it means. But nonetheless, as the athletic director, what do you get off even being the one to brag and boast about this kind of stuff? Fulmer is a very, very interesting figure in this whole power dynamic involving Tennessee football. And if this is the definition of back, winning the, Gator Bowl, barely creeping into the top 10 for Tennessee for the 24/7 Sports recruiting rankings, man, the standards of Tennessee have really fallen a good bit here. But Philip Fulmer apparently feeling very good about himself. One more quick story, then I want to let you hear the really funny Nick Saban audio. So there's a guy named DeTravian Brown. I read this story on AL.com, who apparently faked his recruitment and announced an Ole Miss pledge, and he's not really a recruit or really anything like that. And the reaction you get from some of this kind of stuff sometimes is, how does this even happen? How does this take place? Just given how many college football programs there are, how many players play college football, how many guys try to be recruits. I'm actually surprised this doesn't happen much more often. And I joked before about exaggerating about your height. Is it really all that different from exaggerating about your height to exaggerating about being a recruit, especially when it's not that hard to get a little bit of attention for it? I'm not saying it's a good thing. It's obviously not, but more people doing this, I'm actually a little bit surprised we don't have more guys trying to pass themselves off as a recruit, because honestly, some of this kind of stuff is a little bit hard to verify as it is. But nonetheless, we'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger, I want to give you this. So Nick Saban was asked the other day, hey, a little bit of a slow national signing day for you. Now, what the reporter, I think, meant is that in terms of adding a lot of big names, Alabama didn't really do that. And frankly, got kind of turned down for a couple of big names. Jason Jones went to Oregon, for instance. McKinley Jackson went to Texas A&M. Even to a degree, Enos Rakestraw chose Missouri. I think that's what the reporter kind of meant when he said what he said. But the question was a little bit of a slow national signing day for you. And then Nick Saban kind of goes on kind of a wild rant about that. But if you're a UGA fan, I think you can kind of sit back and know that just maybe programs like the Dogs might be in old Saban's head here a little bit. Here is Nick Saban from Wednesday.
Do you guys take math? Do you have math class?
Not anymore.
Did you learn how to add when you did have math class? Like 22 and 3 make 25? I mean, what's that?
I think you said it wasn't very busy today.
No, I know, but is that what we expected? Yeah, we only could sign 3 guys. That's what we expected, based on math, which is. But it was a very busy day, because the calendar is moved up. All right, so I spend my whole day today, and we spend our whole day today really on next year's recruiting. Does that make sense? So I think I talked to 22 guys today, and I think I talked to 14 guys yesterday. All right, so it was very busy. In fact, by the end of the day today, I was stuttering on the phone and having a tough time speaking clearly. So that's how busy it was.
First of all, credit to the reporter when Saban says, do you do math, have math class? And the reporter says, no, not anymore. Credit to him for kind of firing back at Saban on that. I thought that was pretty funny. But at the end there, when Saban says he was stuttering because he was on the phone so much, I think that's the classic definition of saying the quiet part out loud. I can tell you this, the young lions in this coaching profession are not tired from talking on the telephone. They're just not. Kirby Smart is not, having to go get a glass of water because he spent some time on the telephone. So from Saban's standpoint there, maybe that's not the part that you want to be admitting to the world all the way around. And to me anyway, your mileage may vary, but to me anyway, it certainly comes across as Nick Saban, a little salty about not being number one in recruiting and having some guys late in the process say no to him. Yes, he brought in 3 guys, but it was not necessarily the 3 that he wanted to bring in. With that said, let's kick off the weekend, get ready for busy time around UGA athletics with our Kroger kickoff, and I think we've got every sport accounted for here. Tonight, Gym Dogs at Arkansas. Tomorrow, men's basketball versus Alabama. Goodness knows Georgia needs a win there. Lady Dogs at Florida. That's on Sunday. Then you've got men's tennis at Texas on Saturday. Equestrian versus Auburn on Saturday. I think Auburn's one of the better equestrian teams, I think, anyway. So this may be a rivalry. Softball versus Kent State and UNC Wilmington. That's all weekend. And, of course, 3 former UGA golfers in the field at the AT&T Pebble Beach Pro-Am. That's all weekend. CBS with the TV coverage on that. And you got a couple more doing a Corn Ferry event there as well. So a lot of UGA athletics here this weekend. So make sure you pay close attention to that all weekend long. And, of course, we appreciate Kroger making the Kroger Kickoff possible for us and making DawgNation Daily possible for us here on this Friday there as well. Valentine's savings, you can continue to get them today and tomorrow only. Kroger's got you covered. How about these great deals? $1 Valentine's exchange cards and $5.99 12-count cupcakes when you use your coupon and your card. So you can download the coupons right now, and you can redeem those today and tomorrow, Friday and Saturday, at the Kroger closest to you. So make sure you check that out. Kroger helping you get ready for Valentine's Day. I want to get you ready for that conversation you're about to have with that Florida fan in your life. A great reminder here, Gator Hater Updater. Been a long time since the lousy, stinking Gators have been able to say they've beaten the Georgia Bulldogs, and we don't think that's going to change anytime soon. How about 1,196 days? That's how long it's been since Florida has beaten Georgia, and that is good news here on this Friday. Thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. We'll see you back here again on Monday. And on a video. Time now for our R.S. Andrews cool down. Had a great chance to have some lunch yesterday with our buddy Dari from R.S. Andrews. Always a fun thing to be able to do. So good to be able to talk to him, and now good to be able to talk to all of you. And we will just chat it up about whatever you want to discuss. Before that, though, I'll remind you that if you're got sleet coming outside now, right now, a little cold, that means you want that heating system working the way that it's supposed to be. And R.S. Andrews can get your system back to its factory fresh specs, and they can make sure that it's safe. We've still got a lot of winter left to go. It may get even colder over the course of the next couple of days, so make sure your heating system works. Make sure that furnace is safe. Check them out online at rsandrews.com and get that $99 Mega Furnace Safety Check. They will take good care of you if you do that. I apologize for not having the comments pulled up, but I will pull them up quickly, and we will be ready to go. I'll do Facebook here today first, then I'll do some YouTube after that. And just generally speaking, we'll have a good time for the next 10 minutes or so. I went a little too long yesterday, so let's try to keep this kind of going here in kind of a normal way today, normal amount of time, and then we will just kind of rock and roll here on a Friday. Travis McCullough gives us an and on video. Always fun to do that. Let's see what else is going on. Matt Rugavina apparently filling out some medical forms. Hard to know that. Hard to have to try to do that on a Friday. John Oviedo says, let's make it 4 in a row versus those lousy, stinking Gators. You love the idea of doing that. Melinda Moe on the subject of our buddy Mike being on Feinbaum this week. Yeah, good stuff from him as always. Joel Moody said, reporters should have asked me if he wanted some cheese to go with his wine. Fun stuff there. Mike Mazzell also having some fun at Saban's expense too. Yeah, listen. The Saban rants now are a little different than they used to be. They are. Leon Hutchinson says Saban's always rude. Yeah, he really is. I mean, he's just kind of a bully in these kinds of situations. Justin Brooks says, are you going to check out the XFL and see how Aaron Murray looks in Tressman offense? So this is the former Bears coach, is that right? The CFL dude? And that's Aaron Murray's coach? That actually sounds pretty good. So is this on TV this weekend? Is it this weekend? So it's this weekend. I'm going to try to see this. Connor says no. I'm going to try to see this. I mean, it's got to be better than nothing, right? Got to be better than nothing. But yeah, I'm going to try to do that. Michael Wilson having some fun at Saban's expense. Lynn Johnson Shipman checking out. Lynn, thanks for being on the program today. Robert Reynolds says, I don't love him. That's not true. That's not true. I love everyone. John Anthony says, who's on commit alert for the 2021 class? Well, how about Jeff kind of shouting out James Williams a minute ago? That's certainly fun to think about. Very, very fun to think about that. So Williams is one of those guys that I really like. I like these tall defensive backs. He's certainly an example of that. It sounds like we may not be waiting too much longer to find out some news on James Williams. So that is good times. That is very good times and a great way to kind of get going on the 2021 conversation. I'll take that any day of the week. Parker Tharp says, what do you expect from the running back group this year? I expect this group to still have great success. And frankly, I think the possibility of wider, passing lanes and forcing, guys to defend a little bit more of the field and be more on guard for a variety of different offensive plays might actually make for even more success for the running game. In terms of the pecking order, I would make the favorite to be leading rusher probably Zamir White. I think a lot of that's just on for me, the basis that White's a year older. He is now a year removed, an extra year removed from injuries. And so if we're going to do like Vegas-style odds, and I'm not very good at math, so I won't try to attach odds to these, but my odds favorite to be the leading rusher would be Zamir White. My number 2 name on that will be Kendall Milton. I would probably slot Milton ahead of McIntosh and Cook for right now. No disrespect to those two guys, but we've seen the running back position be a position that freshmen have been able to play before. I think that Milton is certainly an interesting prospect. I think that McIntosh and Cook are as well. but my number 2 name right now would be Kendall Milton, and then between McIntosh and Cook, you'd sort of, I guess, then compare for number 3. So leading rusher, the safest bet, probably White. Second leading rusher, I think safest bet, probably Milton. And then third leading rusher, a debate between McIntosh and Cook, and then we'll figure out how Daijun Edwards fits into all of this. And by the way, we'll sort of figure out how James Cook kind of maybe evolves in a little bit more creative offense this year. But that's kind of what I expect. Pretty good numbers from the group all the way around. Probably not quite as much of an imbalance in favor of running plays compared to passing plays the way we've seen the last couple of years, but still plenty of opportunities for backs. Brandon Howell says he thinks that Cook, playing in more space, not running against 7- and 8-man boxes, will be successful. And it certainly has a chance to be. And, it's so funny how this conversation mirrors so much what we did a year ago when it comes to Cook, because, it's famous last name, it's really, really impressive athleticism and everything else. It just sort of seems like there ought to be a big opportunity for him at Georgia. It just seems obvious, right? And yet I do think the one thing that he's got to kind of combat against, and some of y'all used to give me a hard time for this last year, and obviously, I'm rooting for Cook. I want to have, want to see him have great success. The one real question I want to see answered for him, though, is, does he have a position? It's great to be a running back who could almost be a receiver, or be a receiver who could almost be a running back. That's all really, really great stuff. But at a certain point in time, you have to be a thing. And I think that having a little bit more competent offensive play calling may make it a little easier for Cook to really try to establish, what is he? What is his thing? He's obviously not Dalvin Cook Jr., right? He's a different player than Dalvin has proven to be. So what is the identity of James as a player? And in this new offensive system, he may have the best chance he'll have in his entire football career to really identify and demonstrate that this season. What else? Devin Glenn says he thinks that Edwards might redshirt. He very well might. Very well might. Top Dog says the offense will go through George Pickens. Listen, you don't see very many returning receivers who have more of an interesting profile than what Pickens has right now. It's really kind of funny in a time in which the Georgia receivers were really maligned a year ago, and certainly for most part good reason. The offense overall was kind of thought to be ineffective in the passing game, and yet somehow, some way, Georgia has one of the top returning receivers in the country. It's kind of interesting how that works out. CB says any projections of players that will start as freshmen. Start is always kind of an interesting word, right? Because the definition of starter at player at positions like defensive back, where Georgia cycles a lot of guys, at wide receiver, where Georgia cycles a lot of guys. It's almost not that important to be the first player on the field for the first snap, because that doesn't necessarily signify you're going to play more than others do. But I think of your starting receivers being the top 4 guys in a rotation. Is there a chance that one of the freshmen is one of that top 4? I think there is a good chance of that. I think the safest bet on that for me may be Marcus Roseme. In a lot of ways, we know that Arian Smith is the fastest. We know that Jermaine Burton might be the most athletically spectacular. He was obviously the LSU commit at one point in time, which kind of gives him that extra juice. Justin Robinson's gotten a lot of love as of late because he's on campus, and we're hearing some good things about him as an early enrollee. But Roseme's just kind of been that sort of quiet guy under the radar the entire time. If we're going to say that Daijun Edwards proves himself because he played in an elite program, then what has Marcus Roseme proven by playing at St. Thomas Aquinas? And he's kind of always been there at that, as high a 4-star as you can be without being a 5-star. That's kind of always been somewhere around that ranking that Roseme's kind of enjoyed. Seems like he got a really good career. Seems like he's gotten some great individual coaching along the way. He's obviously a little bit more polished at that position. So by a slight nod, I'd take Roseme as the receiver. Keely Ringo may be athletically the most impressive person in this class, but I don't necessarily see it being him right now as that breakout freshman starter type guy because of how deep I think of Georgia as being a defensive back. Doesn't mean he won't do it, but Ringo wouldn't necessarily be my bet on that right now. I'd say the same thing about Darnell Washington. Athletically, physically really impressive, but when it comes to catching the football, I'm not quite so sure that I don't trust the guys who've been in the program, guys like Rylan Goede, guys like John Fitzpatrick. In terms of catching the football, I think I probably trust those guys right now more than I trust Darnell. Now, athletically, he just may be too good to keep off the field, and that may be the way this plays out. But in terms of those freshmen, Darnell wouldn't necessarily get my vote. Hard to argue anything other than Broderick Jones from the offensive line, just because of we've seen a freshman tackle do this before, albeit at right tackle, whereas Jones might be a left tackle. We've seen that happen before, but we've also seen left tackle start as true freshmen in the SEC. Greg Little did that at Ole Miss, if I'm not mistaken. The guy that he replaced, Laramie Tunsil, also did that as a freshman. I may be wrong on Tunsil, but I'm not wrong on Little. Leatherwood, played plenty for Alabama, including a national championship back in 2017. The point here is, I think that Jones is a pretty good bet on that. And then as far as being in the rotation goes, once again, a position where rotation matters more so than starting, obviously the expectation is that someone like Jalen Carter will definitely be in Georgia's defensive line rotation, maybe in a very similar way to which Trayvon Walker was a part of that rotation a lot last year. So those are my names, and I'm sure I probably left someone out, and you can certainly tell me who I did leave out. Jethro Smith on YouTube says, Kirby's coaches defense, he had the number 1 overall defense. Dan coaches offense, he had the number 25 ranked offense. I think this is really true, Jethro, and I'm assuming you're using sort of the traditional stats like, yards and points and things like that. But no matter if you use traditional stats, advanced stats, whatever, this idea that Dan Mullen is the sharpest offensive mind in coaching, I think there are a lot of coaches who would love to have a word with the people who keep pushing that narrative because, the one thing you can, I think, say about Mullen is he's a good game coach, right? I like looking at point spreads, for instance. Mullen covers the spread a fairly good, percentage of the time. Certainly Mississippi State was pulling some outright wins a lot. Wasn't always beating the top 10 teams, the teams that had more talent than he did. But in terms of, pulling upsets and beating teams he wasn't necessarily supposed to beat, Mullen actually had a pretty good history of doing that. So there is some evidence that suggests that Mullen's a pretty good game coach. Even I'll give that admission and give some credit to that. But what's not true is some idea that there's no better offensive play caller in the sport than Dan Mullen. I mean, you can pick any number of guys, the Lincoln Riley category, all kinds of offensive names who are just far more prolific than what the Mullen offenses have been. So, yeah, I think from that standpoint, if we're going to say that Kirby's expertise is on defense, Mullen's expertise on offense, there is a lot more to validate Kirby as a defensive mastermind than there is Mullen as an offensive mastermind. All right, let me go back over to Facebook here for a moment and find out what those folks are doing. Then we're going to get off the air after that. KT, on the subject of Dominic Blaylock's injury, I'm sure we'll get more of that in March when Georgia comes back to spring practice. Kirby will sort of talk more about that. What I will say about Dominic is, just given how much of a competitor he's always been, my number one assumption in life is how you do anything is how you do everything. And Dominic Blaylock approaches life with a very forward-leaning aggression, and I'm guessing that his injury recovery will be handled very much the same way. So whatever the schedule is, he's on it. He may be ahead of it just because that's kind of the way he approaches things. But obviously it'll be March before we get much more specific physical update on him. Joel Moody says 6 to 8 freshmen possibly in the 2 deep at their position. He says it's a strong class. It is. And listen, you know how like when you're in traffic, and this is going to be kind of a corny analogy, so I apologize in advance. But you know how like you're in traffic and everybody's backed up and you're trying to like get on an exit or you're trying to turn. And there's always going to be like the people that sort of jump the line and kind of get ahead. When you're driving, that drives you crazy, right? Because especially for those among us who are like more like rule followers, you don't really love someone jumping in line, getting ahead of you. But that's just always gonna happen. You're gonna have some guys who just or gals who just kind of skip the line. I think in football, the depth chart's gonna be kind of the same way. If you want your team to be the best it can be, you've got to have a few guys who skip the line. It can't always be senior plays, juniors the number one backup, sophomores and freshmen are the guys below the depth chart on that. If that be the case, there's going to be a ceiling on your progress. There's going to be a cap on how much success you can really enjoy. You want to kind of create the kind of atmosphere where you've got a junior who's played pretty well, you've got a sophomore who thinks he's ready for his time, but my gosh, this 18-year-old, how are we going to keep him off the field? And sometimes I hate the cutthroat part of this because if I was on the other side of it, it would be obviously devastating. But to be the best, and you are in a situation right now with the Alabamas and the LSU's programs like that, where everyone's pulling out every stop to be the best, competition for the top college football programs has never been more intense than it is right now. Given that as the backdrop, how do you get the most out of your roster? You've got to have a few freshmen who are capable of beating out older players for that playing time. And Georgia has some. I gave you a moment ago some of the thoughts of who I thought the most likely candidates are for that. And yet there's still room for that surprise because the deepest possible teams have freshmen who make life uncomfortable for the players who are a little older. There is no resting on laurels at a place like Georgia, and this year is going to be probably another example where that gets proven to be true. John William Adams on the subject of punt returners. Yeah, it's going to be fun to think about. Is it a healthy Dominic Blaylock? Is a guy like Ladd McConkey a part of that conversation? There's no shortage of candidates, it would certainly seem like. Ben Green comparing Dominic Blaylock to Terry Godwin, which is kind of an interesting comparison for sure. Cooper Stevens says don't rush Blaylock. No need to rush him. I mean, Georgia at its best, I think, does require a healthy Dominic Blaylock, but I don't think it's rushing him to say that he might be willing to do that or be able to do that. Rick Martin a little hard on the Lady Dogs. Don't see a lot of hot takes about the Lady Dogs in the comment section, but there you go. Bob Garrison, the subject of replacing Rodrigo's Blankenship points. That's a big story, big offseason for that kicking position for sure. Al Birchfield says you can bet the best player is going to be on the field. And in addition to that, Kirby cycling a lot of players on and off just to get everybody on the field a little bit involved. He has said before you get that better buy-in when you do that. I think that's probably true. Shane Elliott says, we'll make this our last one. He says, with the XFL starting, they do not have a cutoff after they graduate high school to enter the XFL. Do you think they'll start to go after top recruits and offer them good money to start there? I think they very well might. You see that a little bit in basketball right now where you got LaMelo Ball's out playing somewhere. There's that, other recruit that was compared to Ant-Man. He's playing somewhere. So you've seen a little bit more of that in basketball. And didn't DeMar DeRozan, didn't he play somewhere besides college? Somewhere of that same time frame. Ended up going to Europe or something like that. But so you've seen
Jennings.
Yeah, Brandon Jennings, that's who it was. Thank you. So you've seen a little bit of this in basketball. You may see more of that in football. I do think though that football in the college level is a better proving ground than the XFL would turn out to be. And here's what I think is really important is that while if you're a player of the caliber of, let's just use Zach Evans, for instance, because that's the kind of person that you could potentially see maybe doing something like this. Like Zach Evans may be athletically talented enough that he'd be on the NFL's radar no matter what he does. But there were a lot of players that became first-round picks because they played college football. DeAndre Baker's an example of this. If football worked like baseball and, the professional guys were sort of sifting through talent at 18 years old, DeAndre Baker would not have been on the NFL's radar as an 18-year-old. But after 3 years in college, whatever else, at that point in time, all of a sudden, against elite competition for the long period of time, Baker had kind of validated himself. And so from that standpoint, I think that I'm always going to root against these sort of things, XFL, whatever else, that kind of upend the system that's been in place. The college football system has really worked for a lot of guys to get them NFL attention they wouldn't have gotten had they not played college football. And you can say, well, it's imperfect, talent's exploited, they're not paid, whatever else. And that's, I guess, to a degree true. But in terms of a pipeline of producing NFL-ready players, college football does that, to me, better than anything could. So if the XFL tries that, or if some other league tries to sort of get the 18-year-old to come to his league as opposed to going to college football, they may siphon a little bit of talent off that way. I ultimately don't think that's the best proving ground to show that you're ready for the NFL. And I think over the long haul, guys like Baker and others who really validated themselves because of college football, they will be the ones who end up getting hurt the most by that. So that's just kind of my thought on that. Thanks for being here as a part of DawgNation Daily presented by Kroger here today. I remind you to check out the AJC. Get Atlanta news now from AJC.com and just sort of stay up to date on everything happening throughout the city. Of course, one of the cool things about the AJC on Friday, really Thursday and Friday, a lot of that weekend preview stuff, there's always great things happening at restaurants. You got concerts and things like that. You've always got a lot going on when it comes to the city of Atlanta, and the AJC does a good job of keeping you up to date on all of that. Also, Falcons heading towards the NFL draft. You continue to do that. Hawks just made an interesting series of trades here, bringing in a kind of an interesting name and a lot of other movement there as well. So clearly they're trying to get Trey Young some help. You can read about that at AJC.com. And listen, we're Gatorators around here, but we also are big believers that former Florida quarterback Danny Werfel is doing some really good things in the city of Atlanta. So away from football, listen, even Gators can be big-time positive impacts in their community. Werfel is an example of that. There's a good story at the AJC about that. You can read that at AJC.com as well. Thanks for being here. Huge thanks to R.S. Andrews making it all possible. As I said, I had a great lunch with Daria yesterday. We got some really fun things coming down the pike with R.S. Andrews in the year to come. So check them out. They can deliver a smile for you story after story. That's what they've been doing for all kinds of air conditioning issues. Or if your water heater goes out, or if your electrical stuff is all messed up, R.S. Andrews can get you fixed, get you back to factory fresh specs. Find them online at rsandrews.com. Thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger. Y'all have a great weekend, and we will look forward to speaking to you again on Monday. For more DawgNation videos, check out youtube.com/DawgNation.